When Fred Rogers walked onto the Tonight Show stage, carrying a small, sealed wooden box, the studio audience laughed. 300 people seated in the warm amber light of NBC Studio One in Burbank, California, laughed with the particular delight that only Fred Rogers could produce on site, because the man in the red cardigan had that effect on people. He made them feel something they couldn't quite name. Something that sat midway between childhood and safety, and the specific comfort of being seen by someone who genuinely meant it. So when he emerged from behind the curtain on the evening of April 14th, 1983, walking carefully with both hands wrapped around a small rectangular wooden box, the audience assumed it was a prop. Something sweet and charming and perfectly in character for the man who had spent 15 years teaching America's children to manage their feelings and understand that they were loved exactly as they were. Johnny Carson was already leaning forward in his chair, smiling the easy preparatory smile of a man who knows a warm conversation is coming. He was reaching for a joke about the box before Fred had even sat down. And then Fred Rogers set the box on the corner of Johnny Carson's desk. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Johnny, and he did not smile. The laughter in the studio died in the space of 4 seconds, not all at once, in stages. First the people in the front rows who could see his face most clearly, then the middle section, then the back rows. By the time Fred Rogers was fully settled in his chair, the Tonight Show studio was absolutely quiet. 300 people were staring at a small sealed wooden box. Johnny Carson's smile had faded. He was looking at Fred's face the way he had learned, over 22 years of hosting, to look at the face of a guest when something unscripted was beginning. "Fred," Johnny said. His voice was careful, even. "What's in the box?" Fred Rogers looked at him. He looked at the box. He looked at the 300 people sitting in rows in front of him, all of them leaning slightly forward without realizing it. And then he looked directly at the camera, at the millions of Americans who would watch this broadcast later that evening. And he said something so simple that it took a moment to understand what he had actually said. "Everything I have ever learned about love," Fred Rogers said quietly. "That's what's in the box." Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. And the Tonight Show, which had been scheduled to run 90 minutes that Tuesday evening in April of 1983, ran 2 hours and 19 minutes longer than planned. What happened in those 2 hours has never been told in full, until now. But before we go any further, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. April 1983. America thought it knew Fred Rogers. It thought it knew him the way it knew morning coffee and the sound of a screen door in the summer. He was comfort. He was the man who had appeared on public television every weekday for 15 years in a cardigan that his mother had knitted by hand, who changed into his sneakers at the beginning of every program, with a ritual so reliable it had become a kind of national meditation. He was the man who looked directly into the camera and said you in a way that every person watching believed he meant them specifically, not the audience in the abstract. You, the person sitting in front of the television with your specific life and your specific fears and your specific pile of things you were trying to figure out. America thought it knew Fred Rogers. But there was a version of Fred Rogers that almost no one knew existed. Not the television host, not the ordained Presbyterian minister, not the gentle man in the red cardigan, the version that worked in silence, that made phone calls from unlisted numbers, that sat in hospital rooms on Tuesday mornings when the cameras were off and the press wasn't watching, and there was nothing to be gained from being there except the single uncomplicated, irreducible act of being there. That version of Fred Rogers had been operating in complete privacy for 17 years. And on April 14th, 1983, he had decided it was time to open the box. Fred McFeely Rogers was born on March 20th, 1928, in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He was an only child, quiet, overweight, spent his early years navigating the cruelty directed at children who are different, and Fred Rogers was different in every way a child in small-town Pennsylvania in the late 1930s could be. He didn't play sports. He sat at the piano for hours and played classical pieces with a concentration that unnerved the other children. They called him Fat Freddy. It was the blunt instrument of childhood cruelty, wielded daily, and it left marks that never fully healed. But there was one man who saw what no one else was looking for: his maternal grandfather, James Byard McFeely. One afternoon, sitting on the porch in the golden light of a Pennsylvania late summer, the grandfather looked at Fred, who had come home with red-rimmed eyes and dirt on his knees from a fall he hadn't taken by accident, and said something Fred would carry for the rest of his 74 years. "You've made this day a special day just by being yourself. Don't you ever forget that." Fred did not forget. He also did not forget what it felt like to be 8 years old and afraid and completely alone in a world that had decided it did not want him. That memory, those years, that particular loneliness, that was what Fred Rogers built his entire life's work upon. He became an ordained Presbyterian minister in 1963, not to preach from a pulpit. He was ordained for a specific purpose: to work with children through television. His denomination believed what Fred had argued to the Presbytery of Pittsburgh, that television could be a force for genuine emotional truth in the lives of children. That someone could look into a camera and say the things that children needed to hear. That it was possible to minister to people's deepest fears without a church, without anything except a willingness to show up and be completely present. He was right. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood debuted nationally on PBS in February of 1968. Within a year, it was the most watched children's program on American public television. Within 3 years, Fred Rogers had become something television had never produced before. Not a celebrity, not a performer, a neighbor. People felt that. Children felt it in a way they couldn't articulate but demonstrated by the tens of thousands of letters they wrote, addressed simply to Mr. Rogers, trusting that the Postal Service would know where he lived. He wrote back to every single one of them. Every letter that came from a child who was frightened or struggling in a way a form letter could not address, Fred answered himself, in longhand, on personal stationery. Sometimes late at night, after the studio had gone quiet and he had a stack of envelopes in front of him and hours still to go. He did this because he understood what it cost a child to write one of those letters. To sit down with a pencil and organize your most private fear into words and address it to someone you had never met, trusting that someone would take it seriously. He had been a child who needed to do exactly that. He was going to make sure every child who sent one to him received something back worth the cost of having sent it. Wait, do not miss what comes next. Because the letters Fred Rogers received from children, and what he chose to do with a very specific category of them, is the entire reason a small sealed wooden box was sitting on Johnny Carson's desk in April of 1983. And what was inside that box is something that no one in that studio was remotely prepared for. Every week, Fred Rogers received hundreds of letters. Most were cheerful, many were funny. Children drew pictures, they reported on their dogs, but there was a category of letter that existed apart from the rest. That Fred had long ago learned to recognize by a quality in the handwriting before he had read a single word, a kind of weight in the line. A particular carefulness in the formation of letters. The pressure of a pencil applied by small hands trying to get something exactly right, because the thing they were trying to say mattered more than anything they had ever written. Letters from children who were dying. Not metaphorically. Children who had received diagnoses. Children whose parents had been taken into a separate room by a doctor and told, in the careful formal language of medicine, that the situation was serious and was not going to improve. Children who were 8 years old or 7 or 9, and who had been told that their body was not going to keep working the way bodies were supposed to. These children wrote to Fred Rogers, not to ask for anything external, not because they expected him to fix what could not be fixed. They wrote because Fred Rogers was the adult in their television lives who talked about real things. And the thing that had just entered their lives was more real than anything they had ever encountered, and they needed somewhere to put it. Fred read these letters in a different way than he read the others. He read them slowly. He read them more than once. He sat with them the way you sit with something that asks more of you than you were prepared to give. And then Fred Rogers did something he told absolutely no one about. He called the hospitals. He spoke to the parents. He arranged visits. Quietly, without publicists, without cameras. Without a single person from his production company or his network or his management being informed. He would drive himself to the hospital, check in at the nurse's station, walk down the hallway to the room, knock gently, go in. He would sit beside the child for as long as the child wanted him to stay. He would talk about whatever the child wanted to talk about. And if the child wanted to talk about the real thing, the enormous impossible thing that had brought Fred Rogers to a hospital room on a Tuesday morning, then Fred Rogers would talk about that too. Without flinching, without deflecting, without performing a composure he didn't feel. He made these visits for 17 years. He told no one. After each visit, when he returned home, he would go to his study. He would take the child's original letter and fold it carefully and place it in a small, sealed wooden box that he kept on the shelf beside his desk. The box was made of dark walnut. It had a simple brass latch, no lock, no label. He had chosen not to label it because he already knew what was inside. He was building a record, not for publication, not for posterity, for himself. A private account of a thing he was doing in the world that no one would ever know about, because if anyone knew about it, it would stop being what it was. It would become a story about Fred Rogers instead of being a thing Fred Rogers was doing for reasons that had nothing to do with how he was perceived. So he told no one. He kept the box. He kept the silence. By April of 1983, the box contained 43 letters. 43 children. And Fred Rogers had decided it was time to bring the box out of his study and into the light. But what nobody in that studio knew was that the decision to bring the box to the Tonight Show had been triggered by a single letter. One letter, unlike the others in a way, Fred had spent 3 months trying to articulate to himself, unsuccessfully, and had finally given up on articulating. He had decided simply to read it aloud on national television, because the boy who wrote it had asked him to, and Fred Rogers did not make promises he did not keep. What was in that letter would stop an entire studio cold. Before we get there, I want to say something important. This channel exists because of you. If you have been watching these stories and you want to be part of something more, there is a join button right below this video. Channel members get exclusive stories that never make it to the main feed. It is one click and it means everything to us. And while you are there, please hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories, and some of these stories need to be found. April 14th, 1983. The Tonight Show taped at 5:30 in the afternoon for broadcast at 11:30 that evening. Fred Rogers arrived at NBC Studios in Burbank at 3:45, an hour and 45 minutes before his call time. He was carrying the wooden box. The stage manager noticed immediately, not because it was unusual for a guest to bring a prop. What was unusual was the way Fred was holding it. 2 hands, both hands. The careful grip of someone transporting something that cannot be replaced. He sat in the green room for over an hour with the box on his lap, and a cup of tea he did not drink. At 4:25, Fred knocked on Johnny Carson's dressing room door. Johnny answered it. He looked at Fred's face, then at the box, then at Fred's face again. He stepped back without a word. They sat together for 22 minutes. The door closed. When they emerged, Johnny Carson's eyes had a quality that his segment producer would later describe as the stillness that comes after something has landed. Not shock, something more like rearrangement, like a man who has just been handed a fact that requires him to reorganize everything else around it. The taping began at 5:30. Johnny's monologue was measured, precise, effective. But Ed McMahon, who had spent 22 years learning the architecture of Johnny's performance, said afterward that something was different. Like watching a man drive a familiar road in the dark, technically correct, but different from driving it in daylight. At 6:11 in the evening, Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, a man who has spent 15 years telling America's children that they are special exactly as they are. Please welcome Fred Rogers. The audience came to its feet, all 300 of them. Before Fred had taken a single step from behind the curtain, 300 people were standing in the warm amber light of Studio One, applauding with the particular warmth reserved for someone they had loved since childhood. Fred Rogers emerged wearing his red cardigan over a light blue collared shirt and a dark navy patterned tie, his silver hair neatly combed, his face warm. He shook Ed's hand. He crossed to Johnny's desk and shook Johnny's hand with both of his. And then he turned back toward the curtain. A stage assistant appeared, handed Fred the wooden box. Fred carried it to the guest chair. He set it on his lap. He looked at the audience. 300 people saw the box and assumed it was something charming, a prop, something to illustrate a point. Several people in the front rows smiled in anticipatory warmth, because that was what you did when Fred Rogers was in the room with something in his hands. You got ready to be delighted. But look at his face. Look at it carefully, because what you are about to see is the moment everything in that studio changed. Fred Rogers set the box on the corner of Johnny Carson's desk. He settled back in his chair. He folded his hands in his lap. And the expression on his face, which had been warm coming through the curtain, had shifted to something that was still gentle, still entirely Fred Rogers, but weighted with something the audience had never seen on his face before. The laughter stopped, row by row, the way light leaves a room. Johnny looked at the box, he looked at Fred. Fred, Johnny said, his voice was quiet, even, what's in the box? Fred Rogers looked at him, he looked at the box, he looked at the camera. Everything I have ever learned about love, Fred said, that's what's in the box. The studio was silent. Johnny Carson sat very still. Then, after a pause that lasted long enough for everyone to understand that something was happening that had nothing to do with any script, Johnny leaned forward slightly and said the only thing that could be said. Then tell us. Fred Rogers took a breath. He looked at his hands. And then he looked up, not at the audience, not at the camera, but directly at Johnny Carson, one person looking at another person, and he began. It began, he said, with a letter. 17 years ago, a letter from a child. I won't say her name. I have never said any of their names because what they shared with me was private and it belongs to them alone. But this child was 7 years old and she had been diagnosed with a condition that her doctors had told her parents was not going to improve. And somehow, in the way that children absorb information they are not directly given, she knew. She understood, in the way children understand things that adults believe they are protecting them from, that she was very sick. And she sat down and she wrote me a letter. Fred paused. She didn't ask me to fix it, he said. She wasn't asking for anything external. She wrote to tell me that she was scared. That's all. She wrote, Mr. Rogers, I am scared and I don't know who else to tell. The studio was still. I wrote back to her, Fred continued. But I also did something else. Something I had never done before and something I didn't tell anyone about. I called the hospital. I spoke to her parents. And on a Thursday morning in February of 1966, I drove to that hospital by myself and I sat with her for 2 hours. He looked at the box. He said she gave me a letter before I left. Not mailed, just handed to me directly, folded once with my name written on the front in a 7-year-old's handwriting. She said, will you keep this? I said yes. She said, for a long time, I said yes. She said, promise? I said, I promise. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I kept it. And I realized, driving home that afternoon, that I wanted to keep doing that, not just for her, for all of them, for every child who wrote to me from that kind of place. I couldn't fix what they were facing, but I could show up. I could sit in the room. I could answer whatever questions they wanted to ask without looking away. That was something I could do. He said, so I started going. Every time a letter arrived that was that kind of letter, I called. I arranged the visit. I went alone. And when I came home, I took the letter and I placed it in this box. His hand rested on the lid. There are 43 letters in here, Fred said quietly. 43 children, 17 years. I have not spoken about any of them. Not to my colleagues, not to my producers, not to PBS, not to anyone. These visits were not about my career. They were not about my image. They were about the fact that a child had written to me from the darkest place any person can be, and I was in a position to walk through a door and sit next to them, and I could not, in good conscience, choose not to. Johnny Carson had not moved in over 4 minutes. He was sitting with his hands flat on the desk, and his eyes on Fred Rogers with an expression set in the careful way of a man managing something with great precision. He said, Fred, why now? And that was the moment everything shifted. Because the answer to that question, which seemed so simple, was the answer that no one in the studio was ready for. Fred Rogers looked at Johnny for a long moment. Then he reached down and unfastened the brass latch on the wooden box. He lifted the lid. He reached inside with both hands. What he brought out was not remarkable to look at. A piece of paper, folded twice. Small, notebook-sized, written in pencil. The handwriting large and slightly uneven in the particular way of a child still learning to form letters and applying extra care because the thing being written matters more than anything they have written before. Fred held it in both hands. He said, 3 months ago I received this letter. The boy who wrote it is 9 years old. He is very ill. I visited him 7 weeks ago at a hospital in Ohio. When I was getting ready to leave, he pressed this letter into my hand and asked me to do something I had never been asked to do before. He paused. He said he asked me to read it on television. A sound moved through the audience, involuntary, the specific sound of people understanding something at the same moment. Fred said, I asked him why, and he said something to me that I have thought about every single day since he said it. He said, because the other kids who are watching might need to hear it, and I won't be there to tell them myself. What happened in the studio in the next 8 seconds is something multiple members of the crew described afterward in almost identical terms. They all used the same word. They said the room contracted, like 300 people had taken a breath at the same moment and not yet let it go. Johnny Carson's right hand came up slowly and covered his mouth. Fred looked down at the letter in his hands. His voice was steady, the particular steadiness of a man who has been sitting with this moment for weeks, reading these words to himself at night until he was certain he could read them aloud without his voice breaking. He read, Dear Mr. Rogers, I have been watching your show since I was little. You always tell us it is okay to feel sad. It is okay to feel scared. I want you to know that I feel both of those things. I feel them a lot, but I also feel something else. I feel glad. I feel glad that I got to watch your show. I feel glad that someone always told me I was special. I feel glad that there was a neighborhood I could visit that was always going to be okay, even when things here were not okay. I want the other kids to know that. I want them to know that the neighborhood is still there, that it does not go away, that it will be there for them for a long time after I stop watching. I hope you will tell them for me. Your friend, Thomas. Fred folded the letter. He placed it back in the box. He closed the lid and held it closed with one hand, gently, the way you hold something closed that you have decided to keep closed. And then he sat with his hands resting on the lid, and he looked at the 300 people in that studio, and he did not say anything at all. He simply sat with them in it. It took Johnny Carson a full 35 seconds to trust himself to speak. He had been on camera for 22 years. He had kept his composure through things that would have broken most people, because composure was what the chair required of him. He could not, in this moment, do that. His right hand had come up and pressed against the bridge of his nose. He held it there. When he lowered his hand, his eyes were visibly wet, and he was making no attempt to pretend they weren't. Fred, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. Fred looked at him. Johnny said, You've been carrying this for 17 years. Fred said, I've been keeping it. I wouldn't use the word carrying. Johnny said, What would you call it? Fred thought about this, a real moment of thought. Then he said, A promise. I've been keeping a promise. Johnny said, To all of them. Fred said, Everyone. The studio remained in a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large to speak around. Fred reached into the box one more time. What he brought out was not a letter. It was a drawing. Small, slightly crumpled from being folded inside the box, done in crayon. The colors somewhat faded from weeks of being pressed in darkness between paper and wood. The lines uneven in the way of a child's lines, but the composition clear, unmistakable. A neighborhood. Houses, a tree. A small figure standing in front of the houses identifiable by a rough red shape that was the cardigan, and another figure beside it, smaller, looking up. Fred set it on Johnny Carson's desk. He said, Thomas drew this for me during my visit. He said he wanted me to have it so I would remember what the neighborhood looked like from where he was watching. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I put it in the box with his letter. I almost left it there. I almost kept it private, the way I've kept all 43 of them. But Thomas asked me to read his letter on television because he wanted other children to hear it, and I think he would want this scene too. He looked at the drawing on the desk. He said every child who has ever watched this program built a neighborhood like that one, in their minds, in their imagination, a place that was always there, always safe, always going to be okay even when the world outside wasn't. Thomas built one too. This is what his looked like. Johnny Carson looked at the drawing. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the audience sat in complete stillness, long enough that 3 of the 4 cameras had moved to Johnny's face to record what was happening there. When Johnny finally looked up, he looked at Fred. He said, Fred, I need to ask you something, not for the show, just for myself. Fred said, Of course. Johnny said, all those years, all 43 of them, were you ever afraid walking into those rooms? Fred was quiet for a real moment. Then he said, every single time. I was afraid every single time I walked through one of those doors. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm a man in a cardigan who makes a television program. I was terrified every time that I would say something wrong, that I would make it worse instead of better, that I would not be what they needed. He looked at his hands. He said, but I kept going back, because being afraid of not being enough is not a good enough reason not to show up. And because every one of those children had written to me from the most honest place any person can write from and asked me to see them. And when someone asks you to see them, Fred said, the only thing worse than going is not going. Johnny said, did it help them? Do you believe it helped them? Fred Rogers looked at Johnny Carson for a long moment. Then he said, I think the fact that someone came matters more than anything that person says after they arrive. He paused. He said, but I'll tell you what I know for certain, Johnny. It helped me, every single visit. Those children taught me what it actually means to be present, not performing presence, not professional warmth. Actually present in the most difficult room any person can be in, completely there. He said, I don't know precisely what I gave them, but I know what they gave me, and I have been trying for 17 years to put it into every episode of the show, into every time I look at the camera and tell someone they are special. Because what I learned in those rooms is that those words are not encouragement, they are a fact. You are here, you exist, you are known, and that is enough. It has always been enough. He said that's what Thomas understood. The neighborhood doesn't go away. The love that went into making it is still there after the television is turned off. He understood that, and he wanted other children to know it, so he asked me to tell them. Fred placed both hands flat on the lid of the wooden box. He said, so I'm telling them. The silence in the studio was absolute. And then a woman in the fourth row began to cry. Not loudly, the way a person cries when they have been holding something tightly for a long time and something has finally given them permission to release it. And the sound of it moved through the room the way emotion moves through a crowd when one person makes it safe for everyone else to feel what they were already feeling. Person by person, row by row, from the front to the back and to the wings where the crew stood. Ed McMahon pressed the back of his hand against his eye. He didn't try to hide it. Johnny Carson was looking at the drawing on his desk. Then he looked at the camera. The way he had learned over 22 years to look at the camera when what was happening was not entertainment and needed to be acknowledged as something else. He said, 22 years I've been in this chair. In that time I've been lucky enough to sit across from some extraordinary people. Presidents, astronauts, people who changed history, changed art, changed the way we understood ourselves. He paused. He said, and I want to say something about the man sitting across from me tonight, because I think it matters, and I think some of you might not catch it if I don't say it directly. He said, Fred Rogers spent 17 years going to rooms where children were facing things no person should face alone, and he sat with them and nobody knew. Not a network, not a publicist, not a single professional contact or journalist. Nobody. He did it because a child had asked him to see them, and he said yes, and he kept saying yes for 17 years in private without credit, without anything to gain from it professionally except the thing itself. He said, I've spent my whole career talking to people who do extraordinary things in front of cameras. That's this work. But what Fred Rogers has been doing for 17 years happens in the opposite direction. Away from cameras. In rooms where the only person watching is the person who matters most. He looked directly at Fred. He said, that's the thing, isn't it? The things that matter most happen in rooms where nobody is watching. Fred Rogers looked at Johnny Carson. Then he said, that's exactly it. Yes, that's exactly it. Johnny looked down at the drawing on his desk. He looked at it the way you look at something made by someone who is no longer here and cannot make another one. He said, can I keep this? Fred said, yes, I think Thomas would want that. Johnny nodded. He picked up the drawing and held it carefully. 2 hands, both hands, the same way Fred had carried the box into the studio. The Tonight Show taped until nearly 8 o'clock that evening. The broadcast went to air at 11:30 as scheduled. NBC's switchboard received over 42,000 calls before midnight, not complaints. The particular quality of call a broadcast generates when something true has been said where people expected entertainment. People calling to say they had been watching, that they needed to hear it, that they were going to reach out to someone they had been meaning to call. By the following morning, letters had begun arriving at PBS for Fred Rogers himself. From parents, from nurses, from doctors, from social workers, and from children. Hundreds of them with questions they hadn't known how to ask before. Fred answered every single one. He continued visiting, quietly, privately, without cameras, for the remaining 20 years of his life. He built a second box. Fred Rogers died on February 27, 2003. Stomach cancer diagnosed in late January, a progression so swift the gap between diagnosis and death was barely 5 weeks. He had not told most people he was ill. He went to his office. He answered his letters. He was present until presence was no longer something his body would allow. When his family went through his study, they found both wooden boxes side by side on the shelf. The original dark walnut, its brass latch worn smooth. The second one, lighter in color, begun after the Tonight Show broadcast. His wife, Joanne, counted the letters in both boxes together. There were 87. She said Fred used to come home from the visits and sit at the kitchen table and say, quietly, "Joanne, they are so brave. They are just so incredibly brave." She said that's what he brought home every time, not sadness, courage. He always came home with more courage than he left with. Thomas's drawing was donated by the Rogers family to the Fred Rogers Center at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Crayon on notepad paper, slightly faded. A neighborhood. A red figure and a smaller figure beside it, looking up. Thomas's neighborhood. Still there. Still okay. Fred Rogers spent his whole life making sure he was the person who showed up. He showed up in 87 rooms. He did it without credit, without cameras, without anyone watching. For the same reason he put on the cardigan every morning and sat down in front of a lens and looked into it and said, with complete and unhesitating conviction, the thing that every person on earth most needs to hear at least once in their lives. I like you just the way you are. Because he knew from the inside what it cost a person to believe that. And he knew, from 87 rooms, what it meant to a person to have it confirmed by someone who had driven themselves there, who had told no one, who was not there for any reason except that they had been asked to come, and they came. If this story reached you tonight, do one thing before you close this window. Think of the person in your life right now who needs someone to walk through a door. The one sitting in a room that is harder than it should be, who has not asked for help because they don't know how or because they're afraid it won't come. You know who that person is. You have known for a while. Walk through the door. Stay. You don't need the right words. You don't need any credential or qualification or a wooden box. Fred Rogers showed up in a red cardigan with nothing but his willingness to stay, and 87 times that was exactly enough. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear that showing up is enough. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because these stories reach places that Fred Rogers would have recognized immediately. I want to know where the neighborhood is growing. And if someone showed up for you in a room that was hard, tell us about them. Let's remember them here together. The wooden box is still there. And somewhere tonight, someone is watching the way Thomas watched, from a room that is harder than it should be, and they need to know that the neighborhood does not go away. Be the person who walks through the door. Be the neighbor.